So today we're going to be reading one of the chapters from Brexit, What the Hell Happens Next? Because I think this is a very important chapter as to what a lot of discussion during the Brexit, up to lead up to the Brexit, was about how wonderful the World Trade Organization is. However, this was never talked about, because as I've said before in these examples, whenever anyone tried to talk about the reality and the possible situations and what was actually out there, it would very quickly get dragged back to immigration and sovereignty by Farage and co. So we're going to read from this. It's a really good book. Highly recommend it for anyone wanting to know what the hell is going to happen next, because this lays out quite a good lot of scenarios which could potentially happen, a lot of facts. So today we're going to learn about the World Trade Organization. So once Britain is out of the EU, it is in the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Brexit supporters have long claimed that the WTO is a safety net for the UK, a safe place for it to land once it finally leaves Europe. They portray the WTO as a virile, regulation-free wonderland, just waiting for Britain to take its place as one of the world's leading trading nations. It is nothing of the sort. The WTO is a potential regulatory nightmare, where each and every member can trigger a trade dispute against you. To join it, Britain must conduct some of the most technical, complicated, unprecedented trade negotiations in political history. Furthermore, the WTO is not some place you escape to if your deal with the EU goes wrong. The WTO will only work for Britain if its departure from the EU goes well. A decent EU negotiation is a precondition for a successful WTO membership. Leading Brexiteers say that the EU and UK can unilaterally reduce their tariffs with each other and then go to the WTO as a tariff-free entities. This is false. The only way in which this argument would be legal under the WTO rules is if the UK and the EU have signed a trade deal. If they have not signed a trade deal, then they are barred from unilaterally lowering their tariffs towards one another. The WTO has a rule called Most Favoured Nation. This is a very unhelpful name because it entitles the opposite of what it implies. It means you cannot discriminate in your tariffs. If you say you want to drop your tariffs on beef to zero with the EU, you must drop them to zero with everybody else. Britain could indeed unilaterally drop its EU tariffs, but then it would become a completely tariff-free country. Cheap foreign goods would flood the market, hundreds of thousands of people would lose their jobs, and it would make the UK a less attractive country for trade deals, because if tariffs would already be at zero, it would be like haggling with someone who already wants to give you their product for free. Similarly, the EU must apply external tariffs to Britain. If it leaves without a trade deal, it doesn't matter what the German car industry or what anyone else wants. It is not a question of being vindictive. If it ignored the most favoured nation rule, the EU could be deluged by successful disputes that have other massive trade compensation or face retaliatory regulation against its exports in other states. The UK could opt for the stick rather than the carrot and threaten the EU with higher tariffs unless a trade deal is done before the end of Article 50 talks, but this would hit Britain harder than the EU. Britain would have to raise tariffs for all other countries too, starving off its imports and starting its new life as an independent trading nation in the worst imaginable way. Instead, Britain will have to focus in establishing itself independently inside the World Trade Organization. This is not as easy as it sounds, and it might constitute an even more laborious and complex set of negotiations than Article 50. There are no rules for what happens at this point. They simply do not exist. There are WTO rules on becoming a member, but they are irrelevant because Britain is already a member. Some Remainers and a few lawyers maintain that the UK needs to become a member, but the WTO Director General, Robert Alvaro, stated in October 2016, the UK is a member of the World Trade Organization today. It will continue to be a member tomorrow. That is pretty much where the good news ends. From now on, things get seriously murky. Members of the WTO have things called schedules. There are two of them. One on goods and one on services. These are lists of commitments to the other countries laying out your tariffs and subsidies. They determine the terms upon which you trade with other states. They are very long, complicated and boring. A typical schedule lays out things like what percentages share of your local banks and foreign banks are allowed to buy, what kinds of financial instruments can be bought and sold, whether your insurance companies can operate health insurance, the tariff rate on textiles, clothing, cars, flowers and everything else. It is no less than a full description of how you deal economically with the rest of the world. Britain certainly either does or does not have schedules. The legal experts in the WTO are divided. Under one reading, the EU allows our schedule, but because we, a member state, lived under its schedule umbrella while it sorted out everyone's tariffs and subsidies, another reading, we still have a schedule just as we needed to extract it from the EU schedule. If lawyers decide that the former interpretation is correct, there will be some protracted legal process to work out what happens next, which will delay and complicate things. If the latter interpretation is correct, we are in a much better scenario, but still face incredibly arduous and labour-intensive puzzle of figuring out which bits of the schedule relate to us and which bit relate to the rest of the EU. The WTO has rules for modifying schedules, but not for extracting them from a customs union. This is uncharted waters. The reason is because it is uncharted is because no one has ever been crazy enough to try it before. The first thing the UK needs to do is propose a plan to obtain the World Trade Organization's agreement. Unlike the EU, the WTO isn't based on a nation of formal hierarchy. It prefers to get things done by providing a forum for discussion. This sounds very nice, but in practice it means that each and every member state can object to any number of issues at any time. Maybe all other countries on earth will accept the process Britain proposes. Maybe they will not. It is possible that the WTO Secretariat will have to step in and step up the process, or perhaps a neutral state will do it. But even if one of the World Trade Organization's 163 members, which includes all EU member states and also the EU itself as a separate entity, object to any part of what we do, things get complicated. Britain needs to work out what its schedules look like once they've been extracted from the EU and presented to the WTO, and then hope and pray that it can maintain the number of protests from minimise the number of protests from other countries. This process can be either nightmarish or tolerable. The distinction between these positions relies on the skill of the UK negotiations. Fortunately, people want to trade with one another, particularly when it's a country like Britain with a strong consumer base. And it is unlikely at Brussels Britain currently enjoys the goodwill of the WTO, which is helped to set it up. It is seen as a trading nation, inversely averse to the protectionism common to some states. People consider Britain a reasonable country that abides by its global commitments, although Brexit is damaging that reputation. But even then, ministers should not be under any illusion about the sentimentality from the other countries like the US or Australia. The UK will be dealing with professional trade negotiations. These people squeeze you. It's what they do. Trade negotiations are not a place for a group of people to hug. States go into them with a very firm focus on what their interests are, and they take advantage of vulnerabilities to increase their market access and to create opportunities for domestic industries. Usually aspiring member states wrap up all their issues before they join the WTO. But Britain's strange situation means it can probably start trading provisionally on the basis of schedules it puts down while it deals with any disputes over them. What that means is that the UK will form its own calculations from its share of the EU tariffs and subsidies and then start trading on that basis. Any countries which object can then go to the negotiators, which those discussions are then held. Trade can continue on the basis of what has been proposed. Is this legal? No one knows. But it's hard to envision anyone causing too much of a stir over it, and if it did, Britain might be able to use a continuity principle of international law, which does exactly what it says on the tin, in a legal safeguard. Again, it is unclear how well this would work at this point. Everything else is novel. In a sense, it would seem that it is a much more advantageous situation than Britain had in the EU. But there are looser rules on talks, and the UK does not face a cliff edge at which point the economic consequences become severe. But it would not be a useful way of looking at the system. The viabilities of the WTO system are alarming. It's like a regulatory quicksand. Once you get dragged into one dispute, a host of others can open up, leaving you grasping for breath and at mercy of a country's countless predatory trading partners. Britain is going to have to get its schedules clear with all the member states of the WTO, big, small, rich or poor, friendly or unfriendly. And it will be doing this at a moment of profound vulnerability. So that's the World Trade Organization. Yeah, it still doesn't look any good at all. To me, and reading this, I am really not optimistic. The more, like, I've read this book and I've ordered another one, which is sort of, this one you could consider the neutral book. So I thought, I'll get a pro Brexit book, see what they think. So when we get that, we'll probably do some reading and we'll do some comparing, see what the neutral stance thinks to what the pro Brexit book thinks when it gets here. So yeah, fun times ahead, people. Fun times ahead.